Hi friends, welcome back to Literature Guide. After a long interval, here is a video on T.S. Eliot's views on the metaphysical poets. Actually, it was a review of Herbert J.C. Grierson's anthology produced in 1921 named Metaphysical Lyrics and Poems of the 17th Century. T.S. Eliot's essay on the metaphysical poets was published in the Times Literary Supplement in 1921 and later on it was republished in his work Homage to John Dryden. Here in this essay on the metaphysical poets, T.S. Eliot has described the merits of the metaphysical poetry. He has also differentiated between good poetry and bad poetry. You will also find useful information on T.S. Eliot's concepts of dissociation of sensibility and unification of sensibility. If you find the video useful, do like and subscribe Literature Guide. I am very much thankful to my subscribers and non-subscribers. If you want to get more information on this topic, you can also visit a website. The link of the website is there on the screen. I don't want to waste your time. Let's dive into a video and enjoy the video.
T.S. Eliot on the Metaphysical Poets. T.S. Eliot's famous essay The Metaphysical Poets was a review of Herbert J.C. Grierson's collection of poems called Metaphysical Lyrics and Poems of the 17th Century, published in 1921. T.S. Eliot's essay The Metaphysical Poets was first published in the Times Literary Supplement on the 21st of October 1921. It was reprinted in Eliot's work Homage to John Dryden in 1924 and in the Selected Essays in 1932. Thomas Stearns Eliot in his essay The Metaphysical Poets emphasized the fact that the poet of the modern age must be difficult, more inclusive and elusive in order to employ language into his meaning like the metaphysical poets. According to T.S. Eliot, the modern poet should disarrange language, if necessary, into his meaning. According to T.S. Eliot, the metaphysical poets had the upper hand in writing at a time when thought and feeling went hand in hand and they were finely blended into their works of art. T.S. Eliot states that this union of thought and feeling disappeared when the dissociation of sensibility set in about the age of John Dryden. It was John Dryden who first applied the term metaphysical in relation to the poetry of John Donne and asserted that Donne's love poetry affects the metaphysics. Donne's poetry is essentially the poetry of wit and striking contrast of images. The metaphysical poetry is a combination of plain diction, conceit, condensed and elliptical syntax and abrupt beginning. Later on, Dr. Samuel Johnson disparagingly employed the term metaphysical poets in his work Life of Cowley, published in 1777 for the school of poets like John Donne, George Herbert, Richard Crashaw, Sir John Suckling, Henry Vaughan, and Andrew Marvell, including some lesser poets like Abraham Cowley, John Cleveland, Henry King, Lord Herbert of Cherbury and Edward Benlowes. The group of the metaphysical poets was led by John Donne. He considered the metaphysical poets as a race of writers who flaunt their learning and use far-fetched and complex images in their poetry which is devoid of feeling. T.S. Eliot appreciated and praised metaphysical poetry for its strange blending of intellectual appeals, complexity and analytical and ironic vein. According to T.S. Eliot, Herbert J.C. Grierson's collection of named metaphysical lyrics and poems of the 17th century has thrown light upon the richness and varied colors of the metaphysical poetry. The term metaphysical poetry was employed by Dr. Samuel Johnson in a disparaging and abusive manner before the appearance of Grierson's anthology. T.S. Eliot applauds Grierson's work for changing the trend, and the term has no longer an abusive and bitter one. It is interesting to note to what extent the metaphysical poets formed a school, and how far this school as a digression from the mainstream of poetry is a matter of debate. According to Eliot, it is very difficult to define the term metaphysical poetry, but he tried to find out common and traits in metaphysical poetry of John Donne and the other metaphysical poets. Eliot states that it is hard to find any common link between all the metaphysical poets by taking into consideration the use of figurative language and conceit. There is a good deal of difference and variety in their handling of the subject matter also. For example, John Donne and Abraham Cowley use a device which is deemed characteristically metaphysical. Both John Donne and Abraham Cowley elaborated a figure of speech in a condensed, crisp, and argumentative style. Cowley compares the world to a chessboard, and Donne with more elegance and grace compares the two lovers to the two legs of a pair of compasses in his poem, A Valediction, Forbidding Mourning. The poet says, "If they be two, they are two, so as stiff twin compasses are two. Thy soul the fixed foot, makes no show to move, but doth, if the other do." There is catapulting of ideas and comparisons in the metaphysical poetry which requires great understanding and knowledge on the part of the readers. It made the metaphysical poetry obscure and occult. John Donne mingles strange images and striking contrast accompanied with hyperbolic statements in his poems, which heightens the effect of his poetry. For example, in his poem The Flea, John Donne's idea of flea ceases to become a flea as the poem progresses, and it becomes the poet and his beloved as it sucks the blood of both the poet and his beloved, and in this way get them united. This sudden contrast and strange association of ideas is one of the features of Jacobean dramatists of the period like Thomas Middleton, John Webster, and Cyril Tournay, etc. Dr. Samuel Johnson's statement on the metaphysical poets that the most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together, nature and art are ransacked for illustrations, comparisons, and allusions, their learning instructs, and their subtlety surprises, has attracted the attention of modern critics. Dr. Johnson's statement that ideas are yoked and not united is based on his critical principles. But Eliot has proved that Johnson was not right in his judgment by quoting some lines from Lord Herbert's ode. It is interesting to note that Dr. Johnson's criticism brought into light one of the peculiarities of the metaphysical poetry, that is, the analytical quality of metaphysical poets. The dramatic verse of the later Elizabethan and Jacobean playwrights contained a direct sensuous apprehension of thought into feeling. John Donne's poems also demonstrate a direct sensuous apprehension of thought. A thought to Donne was an experience, and it modified his sensibility. Eliot states that the metaphysical poets, together with the Elizabethans and Jacobean playwrights, had a mechanism of sensibility which could grab any kind of experience. It was between the age of John Milton and Victorian period occurred a dissociation of sensibility. The phrase dissociation of sensibility points to a characteristic fault of the poetry of the later 17th century. Its opposite is unification of sensibility, which also Eliot uses to distinguish good poetry from bad. When the poet's thought is unable to transform itself into feeling, the result is dissociation of sensibility, a split between thought and feeling, and therefore bad poetry. A poet may have the best ideas to convey, but they serve no purpose if they issue forth as feelings. Alfred Lord Tennyson and Robert Browning, says Eliot, fail to satisfy this test. They think, but they do not feel their thought as immediately as the odor of the rose. The poet's function is not merely to versify ideas but to transmit them into sensations. By the term unification of sensibility, Eliot means, in his own words, a direct sensuous apprehension of thought, or a recreation of thought into feeling. When this happens, as in the poetry of George Chapman or John Donne, the result is good poetry. Thought is transformed into feelings to break into the heart of reader's heart. It is this meeting of thought and feeling that constitutes poetic sensibility. Eliot further states that the best poetry of William Collins, Thomas Gray, Samuel Johnson and Oliver Goldsmith satisfies our cultivated and refined demands better than the poetry of John Donne or Andrew Marvell. But while the language and diction become more refined and cultivated, the feeling becomes dry, crude and lifeless. It lacks warmth of feeling and emotion. The sensibility and feeling expressed in Thomas Gray's famous elegy written in the country churchyard is, no doubt, refined and pure, but it lacks warmth and charm of Andrew Marvell's poem The Coy Mistress. During the period of John Milton and John Dryden, the dissociation of sensibility was aggravated owing to too much rumination and concentration on feeling and thoughtfulness. T.S. Eliot also finds some flaws in Percy Bysshe Shelley's poems regarding unification of sensibility. The metaphysical poets tried to find verbal equivalent for the mental states and feelings. T.S. Eliot has stressed the need to focus more on variety and complexity, which will result in more complex and varied effects. Use of myths and illusions, and figurative language definitely enhance the effect of modern poetry, just like the poetry of the metaphysical poets. This can be observed in T.S. Eliot's famous poem The Waste Land, which is highly elusive and mythical. The poetry of the great modern poets like Ezra Pound, William Butler Yeats also holds these qualities. The modern poets such as T.S. Eliot, William Butler Yeats, Ezra Pound, and William Carlos Williams, are often linked to the great metaphysical poets. The great French writers and literary artists Jean Racine and Charles Baudelaire peeped deep into the human soul and mind just like psychologists do. They explored human psyche and soul in order to fathom out the depth of human heart. But it is a great misfortune that the greatest masters of English language and diction like John Milton and John Dryden had disregard of the soul, though they had triumphs in the arena of English literature and criticism. Wit is the soul of the metaphysical poetry. It is basically an intellectual quality and expressed in ingenious phraseology, sharp and strange comparisons and striking and brilliant epigrams, etc. During the 17th century, it was applied to fancy, originality, and creative imagination, especially of the metaphysical poets. In brief, it is capacity to identify similarity in dissimilar things and to bring together playfulness with sensuousness. The metaphysical poetry abounds in wit. T.S. Eliot's essay The Metaphysical Poets is a finest product of the author's craftsmanship as a critic. It would be impossible to comprehend the greatness of the metaphysical poets without Eliot's deep interrogation of the metaphysical poetry. He has aptly been called the Matthew Arnold of the 20th century. T.S. Eliot first applied the Aristotelian method of comparison and analysis to the elucidation of the works of literature, and from whom perhaps Eliot borrows his famous phrase dissociation of sensibility. Eliot considers poetry an amusement. As a classicist, Eliot is rather in the line of Aristotle than his followers. In other words, he applies the method of science to the study of literature to be able to see it as it really is. This is what Eliot has to offer to criticism of modern age.
How is the video? I hope you liked the video. I have already produced many videos on English poetry, drama and prose. You can watch all these videos on this channel Literature Guide. You can also visit a website for more information. The link of the website is there on the screen. I will meet you soon with a new video on important topic. Meet you.
Please subscribe Literature Guide.